In a world where power is often hidden behind polished smiles and whispered assumptions, one man steps quietly into a room that wasn't ready for him. A black executive whose presence stirs invisible currents of resistance and disdain. He arrives modestly dressed, carrying nothing but a sharp mind and an unshakable calm, facing a workplace where respect is withheld and prejudice lurks beneath the surface. But beneath the silence and the sneers lies a force few expect. A secret that will flip the script and expose the true nature of power and justice. As the story unfolds, you'll witness how every slight, every whispered insult, and every calculated move leads to a dramatic reversal no one saw coming. Stay with us through this gripping journey. If this story intrigues you, please like and subscribe for more, and share your thoughts and where you're watching from in the comments below. Your voice matters, and this story is just the beginning. Theron Miles arrived outside the towering glass-paneled corporate headquarters of Halston Verity just as the automatic doors slid open. His reflection passed over marble floors and chrome accents that mirrored the kind of cold ambition the building prided itself on. He moved with the kind of composed confidence that never needed to announce itself. His outfit was subdued, a plain gray button-up tucked into a pair of slacks that showed slight wear at the seams, and scuffed brown leather shoes that had more stories than style. On his wrist, a long, faded scar curved beneath a vintage leather-strapped watch. His clean-shaven jaw and close-cropped hair revealed sharp cheekbones and an expression neither friendly nor unkind. He looked like a man who had weathered storms no one here could imagine. Yet his posture bore none of the aggression or assertiveness they were used to in someone stepping into a leadership role. Just calm, steady, collected. The elevator chimed open on the 15th floor. As he stepped out, the air seemed to tense, not because of who he was, but because of how unfamiliar he looked to those who ruled this space. Rows of cubicles stretched along the glass-lined perimeter. The chatter inside was casual, laced with confident familiarity. A few heads turned as Theron walked past, scanning his ID badge as he made his way toward the conference room. A receptionist at the nearby desk frowned at the name, then glanced toward the conference room in confusion. Theron said nothing. He didn't need help finding his way. The moment he entered the room, the temperature changed, not in degrees, but in demeanor. The long conference table was already half filled. Senior associates, project leads, and department coordinators sipped coffee from branded tumblers and chatted in groups of 2 or 3. Laughter floated in bursts. Phones buzzed. Laptops clacked. No one looked up when he entered. No one paused. He was the silence in the middle of a room that didn't think he mattered. One man, in a blue checkered shirt and Patagonia vest, leaned back in his chair, propped his foot up on the corner of the table, and took a bite of a protein bar while laughing with the woman beside him. She noticed Theron and offered him a once-over before turning back to her phone. A few people glanced briefly, then looked past him, as if expecting someone more important to walk in behind. Theron made no introductions. He stepped calmly to the front of the room, placed his folio on the table, and began laying out single-page agendas in front of each attendee. Some took them without a word. 1 or 2 didn't bother to acknowledge it at all. A man in a black hoodie slid his aside without reading it. Another turned it over to use as a coaster. As Theron returned to the head of the table, he scanned the faces before him. Their body language ranged from disinterest to contempt. No one leaned forward. No one looked engaged. The air held that thick, unmistakable mixture of dismissal and unspoken judgment. Still, his voice remained composed when he spoke. "Good morning," he said. No one responded. He continued, "My name is Theron Miles. As of today, I've been appointed to lead this department through a performance realignment. We'll begin with a strategic overview." Behind a muted yawn, someone murmured, "Here we go," loud enough for nearby colleagues to smirk. Theron pressed forward. "You'll find your revised project guidelines in the packet provided. The workflow has been optimized for cross-functional accountability and quarterly deliverables. I'll be reviewing this with each of you one-on-one following this session." He paused, gauging the room. 2 men across from each other exchanged glances and started silently texting beneath the table. A woman at the end of the room swirled her coffee slowly, eyes half closed, pretending to listen. "This division has underperformed for the past 2 fiscal cycles," Theron said. "We're going to correct that." The man in the Patagonia vest snorted without looking up. Another cracked a knuckle loudly, drawing attention to his exaggerated disinterest. Theron continued, unbothered. "You'll notice that effective today, project tiers will be reassigned based on prior output and current capability alignment. I've reviewed the KPIs for every current team member." That made a few heads turn, not out of interest, but insult. Someone muttered, "Here we go with the metrics talk." A woman in a fitted blazer leaned toward her colleague and whispered too loudly, "He doesn't even know who built the current client stack." The chuckle that followed wasn't quiet. Theron said nothing. His hands rested lightly on the edge of the table, one thumb brushing the leather watch strap as he waited a beat. "If there are questions, I'll take them now," he said. Silence stretched. Then a voice near the back asked lazily, "Are you here as a consultant or?" The implication hung. Temporary. Replaceable. Outsider. "I'm here as your new executive lead," Theron replied. "That role is permanent." A soft snicker came from a far right corner. Someone else fake coughed the word diversity. Theron looked in their direction but said nothing. He simply gathered his materials, gave a slight nod, and walked out the door. Behind him, conversation exploded. "This is a joke. Who even is he? The board is out of their minds. He doesn't belong here." The laughter that followed had the ease of people who were sure they were untouchable. No one lowered their voice. No one thought twice. Theron didn't stop walking. The hallway windows reflected his figure back at him, multiplied by glass. In each reflection, his face looked different, tired, patient, quiet, hardened. He passed a framed mission statement and paused for a fraction of a second. Words like integrity. Conversations didn't stop when he entered. They simply redirected. 3 tables were already full, laughter pouring from them in bursts that felt performative and forced. A 4th table held just 3 employees, space clearly left for more. But as Theron approached with his tray, one of them looked up, made eye contact, and then leaned toward her colleagues. Within seconds, the group stood up in sync, grabbing their drinks and containers in unison, walking to the far corner with half-eaten meals, like suddenly the table had developed a leak. Theron said nothing. He placed his tray on the recently vacated spot, unwrapped a sandwich he'd brought from home, and sat down alone. From the next table over, a man glanced at him sideways, then turned his chair slightly away, not too obvious, but just enough to say, "You're not part of this." A pair of interns passed behind him, snickering into their cups. One of them gestured subtly toward Theron's shoes, then whispered something that made the others suppress a laugh. Across the room, someone called out a joke loud enough to fill the space. The punchline landed, and several people erupted into laughter. Theron took a calm bite of his sandwich. His face didn't change, but he noticed everything. After a few minutes, he stood and walked toward the employee fridge. It was tucked into the far wall near the microwaves, a sleek, stainless steel appliance humming softly. He opened the door, scanning for the second container he'd brought that morning, prepped and labeled with the company's own standard sticker, though he hadn't written his name on it. No one did. Containers were always left unlabeled, and no one had ever complained. But now his was gone. A single post-it note sat in its place on the middle shelf, stuck to the cooling rack. It read, "Discarded. No name." He stared at it for 3 seconds, just enough to register the intention. Other unmarked containers remained untouched, lined along the shelves like usual. Some had been there for days. One was clearly leaking. No one had thrown those out. He crumpled the note, tossed it into the bin, and closed the fridge quietly. A junior staffer near the sink turned to rinse her cup and shot him a quick glance. When she realized he'd seen the note, she looked away too fast and exited without a word. As Theron made his way back to his table, 2 associates had settled into the seats across from where he'd left his tray. They glanced up as he approached, exchanged a knowing look, and then resumed their conversation without acknowledging him. There was no malice in their expressions, only dismissal, the kind bred from entitlement and the belief that proximity gave them hierarchy. Theron didn't argue. He picked up his tray and walked to the high-top counter along the window, the one no one liked because of the direct sun. He ate there quietly. He chewed slowly, methodically, his eyes watching the reflection of the room in the glass. He didn't need to turn around to know who was whispering or who glanced over only when they thought his head was down. By the time he finished eating, the room had mostly cleared. Meetings resumed. Laptops beckoned. Voices thinned. Theron took his tray to the dish station, washed it thoroughly, dried it with a paper towel, and returned it to the cabinet. As he was about to leave, he overheard a voice coming from just around the corner. "He's still here?" Thought he'd vanish after the first week. Another replied, "Please. He'll vanish once the board realizes he can't do anything." A laugh. Can't even keep his own food in the fridge. Theron stood still for a second, then stepped back through the hallway as though he hadn't heard. He didn't confront. He didn't raise his voice. That wasn't his strategy. His movements remained smooth, controlled, unbothered in appearance. But deep beneath that calm lay something sharper now, a cool calculation, a reshaping of the internal map he was drawing. The office wasn't just toxic. It was coordinated in its exclusion. It wasn't loud or violent, but subtle and repeated, like slow erosion, meant to push him outward without ever making a formal accusation. And they believed it was working. They assumed the polite silence he carried was submission, that his quiet was retreat, that because he didn't flinch, he didn't feel. They had no idea they were under review, being noted one by one in precise categories. Those who whispered, those who watched, those who laughed. By the end of the day, Theron stood in the corner near the window on the executive floor, reviewing printed reports on department turnover. Names he now recognized matched performance metrics, absentee rates, HR complaints that had been buried beneath layered language. The same people who had laughed at him in the conference room had reputations carefully shielded by each other's silence. He highlighted one line in red, then paused. He turned toward the empty hallway and watched the elevator numbers scroll upward. He'd made no enemies. Not openly. Once inside the executive suite, he reviewed the scheduled agenda, cross-referenced departmental reports, and finalized the presentation slides for the 9:30 a.m. strategy briefing he would lead. It was a pivotal meeting, designed not just to steer the failing division back on course, but to establish a clear voice of leadership. For Theron, this wasn't about impressing the room. It was about structure, about clean execution, and shared accountability. But as the room filled closer to 9:30, the energy took on a familiar, hostile weight. Colleagues filed in with subtle glances at each other, some exchanging smirks, others hiding their reactions behind coffee mugs and whispered sarcasm. The projector was already on, its light humming against the screen at the front of the room where Theron stood ready. The moment he began speaking, the temperature dropped, not physically, but tonally. As he outlined the new cross-team integration framework and presented a series of deliverable milestones, he noticed a lack of eye contact, the kind of inattentiveness reserved not for content, but for the person delivering it. Still, he maintained composure. Every sentence was precise, every graph explained with context, every bullet point tied to actionable goals. Yet despite the clarity, he could feel the room lean away from him. Then, as he concluded the initial segment and asked for observations, silence followed. Until Jacob, an ambitious, sharply dressed junior analyst who had only joined the company a year earlier, cleared his throat and leaned forward with affected confidence. "So I've actually been thinking about a similar structure," he began, casually tapping his pen on the edge of the table. "And I think a staggered project stream might help avoid what's been happening with bottlenecks." Without acknowledging that Theron had just spent 15 minutes walking through that exact approach, Jacob launched into a nearly word-for-word paraphrase of the integration model. He mimicked the phrasing, referenced the same team overlap strategy, even cited the same quarter deadlines, yet rebranded it all under the guise of his own recent brainstorm. As he spoke, heads began to nod around the table. One manager smiled, another murmured in approval. Someone scribbled notes. It was deliberate, not a misunderstanding, not parallel thinking. It was an erasure in real time, dressed as contribution. Theron stood still at the head of the room, not interrupting, not challenging. But he watched the performance with narrowed attention. When Jacob finished, the room reacted as if something new had been introduced. Theron raised his chin slightly and said calmly, "Thank you, Jacob. Your summary aligns exactly with what I just presented. That model is in the documentation you received this morning, developed over the past 4 weeks based on the performance review I initiated in Q1. A beat passed. Jacob froze for a half second. A few eyes darted to their handouts, which indeed confirmed Theron's ownership. But the moment passed too quickly for accountability to take hold. The response was tepid, polite, dismissive. The conversation moved on. No one corrected Jacob. No one reinforced Theron's authority. And though no words were said, the message echoed clearly. They were willing to pretend he hadn't spoken first. The second blow came mid-afternoon. Theron returned to his office after a set of check-ins and opened his company dashboard to upload updated budget allocations for the finance team. His credentials were rejected. Frowning slightly, he re-entered them. Again denied. The screen blinked red, showing an error message. Access denied. Unknown account login. Please contact system admin. He paused, then dialed IT directly. After several rings, a voice answered, "James, the system administrator." When Theron identified himself, there was a brief hesitation on the other end. James cleared his throat and said, "Yes, sir. We flagged a login attempt on your account as irregular. It triggered an automatic lockout." "I'm the project lead," Theron replied. "That account is under my name." Another pause. "Yes, I see that now," James said uneasily. "It came through this morning, but the flag had already propagated. I can restore access shortly." Theron didn't press. He thanked him, hung up, and stared at the lock screen. His name, his credentials, had been flagged as unfamiliar. Inside the system, where he was listed as project lead, where his credentials were ranked above nearly every manager on staff. It wasn't an innocent error. It was a message, coded in administrative language, designed to unsettle, to provoke, to suggest he didn't belong. It aligned perfectly with the pattern he was already mapping. During his one-on-ones that afternoon, he noticed 2 team leads arrive late, both of whom had been CC'd on the meeting invites he personally sent. One of them apologized with a shrug and blamed calendar syncing. The other didn't apologize at all. At one point, a junior staffer walked past his open office door and muttered something under her breath about ghost leadership. She didn't see him glance up. She didn't think she was being heard. But Theron heard everything. Every tone, every detail, every act of subtle rebellion aimed at undermining his place, his voice, his right to lead. And in their efforts to erase him, they only made themselves more visible to him. That night, Theron remained long after the floor emptied out, lights dimmed down to half brightness. He unlocked a separate drive, one that wasn't connected to the internal system, and began archiving communication records. Not out of vengeance, but out of necessity. The same employees who mocked his leadership had sent him reports, files, emails, each time confirming that he had, indeed, been the architect of the strategy they now tried to claim for themselves. He wasn't collecting for retaliation. He was collecting to prepare. They were the carefully disguised tools of exclusion, acts that seemed small on their own, but added up like tiny cuts. Still, he showed up calm, present, and ready. When the elevator doors opened on the 15th floor, he walked down the corridor lined with framed accolades and the mounted company organizational chart, a visual hierarchy of titles and divisions. He stopped, not out of habit, but because something looked off. The executive wing usually listed his name, printed in clean Helvetica next to the title division lead, Strategic Ops. Today, that space was blank. In its place, a laminated sticker had been affixed diagonally over the space where his name should have been. It read, "Position open." At first glance, it appeared official, same formatting, same font size. But it wasn't the standard printout. It was improvised, slapped over his name like a warning sign. Theron stepped closer. Beneath the sticker, a faint outline of the original text was still visible, as though the person who replaced it had done so hastily. No explanation, no internal memo, no notification from HR. Just an anonymous reclassification placed in plain view, announcing to every employee on that floor that Theron Miles did not belong. He looked around, calm and collected, but alert. A junior associate passed behind him, slowing slightly when she noticed him standing there. Her steps faltered, but she said nothing and kept walking. Theron took a photo of the board with his phone and continued down the corridor, face composed but expression unreadable. At 10 a.m., the department convened in the Westbridge conference room for a strategy sync. It was a standard weekly gathering, but given the ongoing chaos in the division, Theron planned to use it to reset tone and direction. As he walked in, folders in hand, he noticed the pot of coffee on the side table, steam still rising from its silver cap. He nodded slightly to a staffer seated nearby, then walked toward the pot to pour himself a cup. He tipped the carafe. Nothing. Bone dry. Confused, he checked the backup dispenser beside it. Also empty. He looked around. 10 other employees sat in the room, nearly all holding fresh coffee. Some sipped. Others tapped their cups rhythmically on the table's edge. The timeline didn't match. The pot couldn't have emptied between his arrival and the start of the meeting. Someone had deliberately poured it out or timed it so the pot ran out just before he entered. He said nothing. No complaint. No reaction. He sat down at the head of the table, opened his folder, and launched into the agenda. As he spoke, some employees jotted notes, but many simply nodded politely or stared at their laptops. A few stifled yawns. A senior manager across from him began typing with heavy keystrokes, loud enough to disrupt the flow. A woman nearby whispered something to her neighbor, both of them stifling laughs. Theron didn't waver. He completed his presentation, reviewed action items, and set deliverables without a hitch. But when he stood to leave, someone coughed under their breath, just loud enough to be heard, and said, "Might want to restock the coffee before the big boss shows up next time." The sarcasm wasn't subtle. Laughter followed, muffled but clear. Theron didn't turn. He walked out with the same poise he had walked in. Back in his office, he opened a document he had been compiling, a personal log, meticulously organized by date, time, and behavior. The org chart incident went under public undermining. The coffee game landed in operational sabotage. The pattern was crystallizing. These weren't passive oversights. They were coordinated, intentional efforts to push him to the edges, deny him recognition, rob him of acknowledgement, and dilute his presence in every room. It was a tactic older than the industry, older than the company, one that operated just beneath the level of policy enforcement. Nothing blatant enough for HR, nothing bold enough to be labeled discrimination. But every act carved out his legitimacy a little further. By early afternoon, he received a call from a procurement officer requesting his approval for a software license purchase. The moment he logged into the system to authorize, he found his role permissions had been downgraded. Not removed, just limited. Enough to block approvals, to keep him from completing his role. He sent an inquiry. The reply came 2 hours later. Access adjusted due to recent internal structure shifts. Should be restored by next week. No structure shift had been announced. No change in leadership. Just another excuse. Another slow peel of his influence. And all of it happened in shadows, behind spreadsheets and silence. Later that evening, he passed by the break room on his way out. The light was still on, the whiteboard filled with doodles and reminders. A new entry stood out at the bottom corner, scrawled in bold black marker, Office Morale Leaderboard. It listed several team names with points next to them, scores awarded for things like meeting participation, team spirit, and cross-functional enthusiasm. His team, the division he was leading, was dead last. Next to it, someone had drawn a cartoon, a stick figure slouched in a chair, with the word dull written above it in a speech bubble. He stared at the board for a long moment, not because it surprised him, but because it confirmed everything he had begun to suspect. The culture here wasn't just indifferent to him. He was dressed sharply, a dark blazer over a crisp white shirt. His tie a muted charcoal, subtle but professional. His laptop bag hung from one shoulder, and a well-organized stack of printouts lay in his hand. As the room filled with senior executives, department heads, and a smattering of board members, Theron felt the weight of scrutiny settle immediately. The seats were nearly full. The energy buzzed with anticipation, but also with unspoken judgment. As he approached the podium, a woman sitting near the front looked at him with narrowed eyes and exchanged a whisper with a colleague that made the corners of her mouth twitch upward in a smirk. Theron opened his laptop and connected it to the projector. His presentation slides lit up on a large screen, displaying graphs, charts, and key points outlining the strategic plan he had spent months developing. He began with measured confidence, explaining the department's current challenges and the roadmap for growth. His voice was calm, but carried the authority of a man who understood the stakes. Then, suddenly, the screen flickered and went black. The projector shut down entirely. An awkward murmur rippled through the room. Theron glanced down at his laptop. It was still running. He tapped the keyboard. Nothing. The room remained dark except for the ambient light from the ceiling. Someone from the technical support team was already standing and heading toward the front, mumbling about connection issues and hardware glitches. Theron smiled politely and waited, knowing these delays were sometimes unavoidable, but also acutely aware of how convenient this timing was. After a brief 10-minute interruption, the lights dimmed again, the projector whirred back to life, and the presentation resumed seamlessly, not for Theron, but for the speaker immediately following him. A white male director with a reputation for smooth pitches and polished charisma. His slides loaded without a hitch, and the room quickly refocused, applauding the next presenter with genuine enthusiasm. Theron stepped down quietly, collecting his notes. As he moved toward his seat, he noticed a white sheet of paper taped firmly to the backrest of his chair. Without unfolding it, he recognized the unmistakable crude style of the cartoon sketched on it. It depicted a stick figure with exaggerated arms flailing over a podium, a speech bubble filled with indecipherable scribbles. Underneath was scrawled the phrase, "newbie overcompensating," and a crudely drawn laughing face emoji. Theron felt the paper's thin weight, but did not crumple it or react. He slipped it into his folder. Later, when the room emptied, he discreetly photographed the drawing and added it to his growing digital log of incidents. He knew this was more than a childish prank. It was a public dismissal, a message to anyone paying attention that he was not to be taken seriously, that his leadership was a joke. Despite the insult, Theron maintained his composure. He had learned the value of calm in the face of provocation. His mind mapped each slight like a strategist preparing for a long campaign. In the corridors afterward, whispers followed him. A group of mid-level managers laughed as he passed, one muttering, "Guess the new guy isn't used to the big leagues." Another said maybe he should stick to junior projects. None of these were spoken openly. They were the quiet murmurs that carried just enough weight to sting. Theron heard them all. In his office, he pulled out the corporate org chart and noticed that no acknowledgement had been made to the disruption or the ridicule he'd endured. Instead, the culture of dismissal was reinforced by silence. Even the IT tickets he'd opened to report the projector failure had been marked resolved, with no follow-up or investigation. The entire system seemed complicit in ignoring his presence and undermining his credibility. As night fell and the building emptied, Theron sat at his desk, reviewing emails from team members who had responded positively to his vision, unaware of the struggles he faced outside that room. His resolve hardened. He was not just fighting for departmental improvement. He was fighting for recognition, respect, and survival within a system rigged to exclude him. He pulled up security footage from the meeting rooms, hallway cameras, and observed the faces of those who had whispered and laughed. Each one was now part of the dossier he was quietly assembling. His name was conspicuously absent from the list of recipients and contributors. When he cross-checked with a trusted assistant, she confirmed that his email address had been deliberately excluded from the distribution list. It was a silent but sharp message. "You are not part of the conversation." He composed a terse but professional reply, requesting immediate inclusion, But the response was slow and vague, full of platitudes about email system errors and oversights. The pattern was clear. Later that afternoon, an invitation arrived in the company-wide calendar for a celebration of Team Success event. The venue was an exclusive rooftop bar downtown, promising panoramic city views and catered refreshments. Every department was invited. Every senior member received a calendar alert, except Theron. His direct reports looked at him apologetically, but explained that the invites had been sent by HR, and they had no control over the guest list. His name was omitted, erased from a social gathering designed to reinforce team unity and reward contributions. Alone in his office, Theron stared at the glowing calendar invitation others had shared on their screens. It was a cold exclusion, a visible sign that he was being erased socially as well as professionally. When the event took place that evening, Theron chose to work late instead of attempting to attend uninvited or causing a scene. He knew the atmosphere would be hostile. Photos circulated the next day showed smiling faces, clinking glasses, and moments of camaraderie, none of which included him. The deliberate isolation was an echo of earlier, subtle humiliations, but now it was unmistakably public. No official reason was given, no formal message sent. Just omission. In the following days, Theron noticed a shift in everyday interactions. His team members, who once greeted him briefly, now passed by without eye contact. Meeting invites that previously included him came with last-minute cancellations or were replaced with alternative leadership names. The workplace grew colder, more fractured. During group meetings, people spoke over him or ignored his input, as if he was a ghost sitting at the table. Even some of his closest allies started to distance themselves, wary of the consequences of association. In one particularly painful moment, Theron overheard two colleagues in the hallway whispering, "Better not get too close to him. Doesn't want to last here." The isolation extended beyond social settings. Access to information was restricted subtly but effectively. Documents were not shared. Important updates came late or through indirect channels. When Theron requested status reports, responses were delayed or incomplete. The infrastructure of support he needed to succeed was being dismantled piece by piece. Yet, despite the growing walls around him, Theron did not retreat. Instead, he doubled down on meticulous documentation. He archived emails, saved meeting minutes, and collected testimonies. He began to build a record not only of the project's progress, but also of the systematic efforts to exclude and undermine him. At night, after the office had emptied, he reviewed security footage from the main entrance and hallways, noting who lingered nearby when he arrived or left, who avoided passing him in tight corridors, who whispered in corners. The surveillance was not just about safety. It became a map of the social architecture that worked against him. Theron also started scheduling brief, confidential check-ins with the few employees who had not yet distanced themselves, individuals who expressed concern or offered support quietly. These meetings were careful, discreet, and designed to foster trust without raising suspicion. His network was small but growing, built on shared understanding rather than forced proximity. The weeks passed, and the isolation sharpened the edges of his resolve. He knew the tactics used against him were textbook exclusion, a method to wear down opposition without open confrontation. Just before sunrise, a sleek black SUV pulled up to the front entrance of a corporate tower. The morning fog clung low to the streets, diffusing the city lights into a soft haze. Theron stepped out of the vehicle, flanked by a tall, sharp-suited legal advisor carrying a slim leather briefcase. His clothes were immaculate, navy tailored suit, crisp white shirt, polished shoes. But it was the calm confidence in his gait that commanded attention. This was no longer the sidelined executive quietly navigating hostility. This was a man who owned the narrative. They walked through the revolving doors and past security without delay. The receptionist blinked twice, recognizing him, but uncertain of the protocol for a figure whose official status had yet to be publicly revealed. Theron presented credentials that now included the title Interim Chief Executive Officer and Chairman, M&A Oversight Committee. As they rode the elevator to the 17th floor, Whispers trickled through the staff. Phones buzzed with texts and emails asking if the rumors were true. The office buzz shifted palpably: speculation, disbelief, unease. In the main conference hall, just before the day's first all-hands meeting, Theron sat at a long table alongside board members and senior executives. His legal advisor handed over a heavy folder stamped "Confidential Final Approval Documents." The atmosphere was thick with tension. No one was sure what would come next. At precisely 9 a.m., all computer screens across the entire office suddenly logged out, forcing employees offline. A message flashed briefly on every monitor: "System reboot in progress." 2 minutes later, as systems came back online, an all-staff email arrived simultaneously in every inbox. The subject line read, "Organizational Announcement." The message was clear and unambiguous. Theron Miles had officially been appointed CEO and executive chair of the corporation's parent company, a role that came with sweeping authority over operations and strategic direction. The company's shares had been acquired quietly over the past month through a series of private transactions that had now been finalized. The email detailed Theron's vision for the company, highlighting his commitment to innovation, equity, and transparent leadership. Employees scrolled through the message in stunned silence. No one could deny the facts. The man they had ostracized, undermined, and humiliated was now at the very top. Phone calls and messages erupted as the news spread quickly. Among the stunned were those who had openly mocked him. The same employees who had laughed behind closed doors now found themselves grappling with the reality that their former target wielded ultimate authority. As the meeting commenced, Theron stood and addressed the entire staff with the quiet strength that had defined his leadership from the beginning. His voice was steady, carrying over the hushed room. "I understand the challenges this division and this company have faced," he began. "I also understand the resistance change often provokes. But I am here to lead with transparency, accountability, and respect for every member of this organization. Together, we will rebuild trust and chart a new course." The room remained silent, some employees exchanging glances, others avoiding eye contact. No one applauded immediately. This was not a celebration, it was a reckoning. Later that day, Theron's legal advisor distributed a list of personnel changes. Several managers who had actively participated in undermining Theron were instructed to report to Human Resources for reviews. Their access badges were deactivated without fanfare. The message was unmistakable. Power had shifted. As Theron walked through the halls, the atmosphere was charged with a mixture of apprehension and grudging respect. A few employees who had supported him quietly offered nods of approval. Others kept their distance, wary of aligning too openly. Theron made a point to stop by the break room where exclusionary events had taken place weeks before. He quietly instructed the facilities team to restock supplies and improve amenities. His gaze lingered on the whiteboard scoreboard, now slated for removal. The old culture of petty division was coming to an end. That evening, in the solitude of his new office overlooking the city skyline, Theron opened a letter left on his desk. It was from his father, a man who had faced similar battles decades before but never attained the power his son now held. The letter was a reminder of the legacy of perseverance and dignity that had carried them both. Theron's legal advisor and a security detail accompanied him as he awaited the arrival of key department heads, many of whom had been vocal critics or silent saboteurs during his tenure. One by one, these senior managers were escorted into a sleek conference room with floor-to-ceiling windows that looked out over the city skyline. The room was stark and imposing. The door closed behind the last invitee with a definitive click. For hours, discussions took place behind that closed door, the content confidential but the consequences evident. When the meeting adjourned, only a handful of those summoned emerged back into the hallways. The 7 who remained inside were immediately relieved of their positions. Their security passes were deactivated on the spot, and arrangements were made for their exit from the premises. No protests. No resistance. The message was clear. The old guard no longer had a place in the new order. Meanwhile, a team of executives worked swiftly to remove the outdated organizational chart displayed prominently in the main lobby. Its faded edges bore the names and titles of the former leadership, with many positions now vacant or reassigned. The new chart was unveiled quietly but with authority. Theron's name stood at the top in bold lettering, his title now officially Chief Executive Officer and Chairman. Below him, departments were realigned, reporting lines simplified, and accountability channels clarified. The chart signaled a fresh start, a clean slate, one that underscored the restructuring Theron had promised. As the day progressed, Theron took personal control of communication channels. An all-staff email was sent detailing the leadership changes, the company's renewed strategic vision, and the commitment to inclusive growth. He also instituted open-door hours where employees could meet directly with him or his leadership team to voice concerns or ideas. This transparency was a stark contrast to the opaque decision-making that had dominated before. Employees who had felt marginalized found themselves invited into conversations for the first time. The company's internal social networks buzzed with cautious optimism. Theron personally oversaw the reassignment of key projects to new managers who shared his values of collaboration and respect. Teams previously fragmented under divisive leadership began to coalesce. There was a renewed focus on mentorship programs, diversity initiatives, and skills development workshops. Under Theron's leadership, policies that had been ignored or downplayed, such as anti-discrimination training and grievance procedures, were revitalized with mandatory participation and clear enforcement. But the transition was not without tension. Some remaining staff resisted the changes, clinging to old alliances or fearing for their positions. Theron met resistance with calm firmness, emphasizing accountability and the necessity of change. He engaged in direct conversations with dissenters, offering clarity but not concessions. The cultural shift was palpable. No longer tolerated were the whispered exclusions or the covert sabotages. Theron encouraged a culture where respect was the baseline expectation. By midweek, the atmosphere in the halls had changed. People greeted one another with renewed professionalism. Meeting rooms were filled with active participation, not covert sideline conversations. Theron made visible efforts to recognize contributions openly, highlighting team successes and individual achievements. His presence was both commanding and approachable, a blend of authority and empathy. He attended town halls, answered difficult questions with honesty, and set a tone that valued progress over perfection. Outside the immediate office environment, Theron commissioned an external review of company culture by a reputable consultancy firm specializing in organizational change. The goal was to uncover systemic weaknesses and propose lasting reforms. This independent audit reassured staff that change was not superficial, but committed and ongoing. As the first full week under his leadership came to a close, Theron reflected on the magnitude of the transformation. The old structures of exclusion and denial had been dismantled, replaced with a framework designed to elevate every employee's voice. He knew challenges remained. The scars of past divisions would not heal overnight, but the foundation was solid. Standing in his corner office overlooking the city, Theron allowed himself a moment of quiet satisfaction. Early that week, the Human Resources Department, now directly reporting to Theron, initiated a comprehensive audit of employee conduct, focusing specifically on the patterns of exclusion, insubordination, and covert sabotage that had plagued the organization for years. To accomplish this, the HR team requested access to months of security camera footage from various office locations, corridors, meeting rooms, and communal spaces. They were determined to document not just blatant violations, but the subtle, insidious behaviors that had been ignored or dismissed under previous management. The footage was painstakingly reviewed by a dedicated team, cross-referenced with internal complaints, emails, and testimonies collected during Theron's private meetings. It revealed a pattern that was both stark and disheartening. There were moments caught on camera where employees exchanged cold stares laced with contempt, subtle eye rolls when Theron entered meetings, gestures of dismissal like turning backs or whispering behind hands. The microaggressions were subtle, too slight to confront directly, but they accumulated like a silent storm. More overt acts were also documented. A conference room door slammed abruptly after Theron left. Confidential documents left intentionally incomplete or misplaced. Coordinated accidental schedule overlaps that excluded Theron from critical discussions. Armed with this evidence, Theron convened an all-hands HR session, an unprecedented move signaling a break from the company's former culture of silence. Employees from every department gathered in the main auditorium, the air thick with anticipation and unease. The HR director presented the findings plainly, without sensationalism, emphasizing the company's renewed commitment to accountability, respect, and inclusivity. The footage played on large screens, not to shame individuals, but to confront the reality of a toxic environment that could no longer be tolerated. Reactions varied. Some employees looked away, faces flushed with guilt or fear. Others sat rigid, arms crossed defensively. A few exchanged uncomfortable glances as whispered apologies rippled through the crowd. Theron addressed the assembly afterward, his voice steady but resolute. What we are seeing is a culture that failed many of us, one that allowed behavior undermining our collective success. This ends now. A series of policies were introduced. Zero tolerance for harassment or discrimination, clear protocols for reporting violations, mandatory training on workplace respect, and transparent disciplinary procedures. Almost immediately, consequences began to unfold. Employees identified in the footage or complaints were called in individually for reviews. Some were given warnings and required to complete training programs. Others, whose conduct was severe or repeated, faced suspension or termination. For several senior staffers who had actively resisted Theron's leadership, badge access was revoked with no prior warning. When one such individual tried to enter the building the next morning, their security card was declined. Cameras captured the moment as they stood frozen, stunned, while a company representative approached to escort them out. Their office was sealed off, their belongings packed into labeled boxes to be shipped or stored. Word spread quickly through the company. No one was immune to accountability. These actions send a powerful message to all employees. The era of covert sabotage and quiet disrespect was over. The workplace was no longer a place where petty games of exclusion or silent aggression would be tolerated. In parallel, Theron initiated a comprehensive review of internal communications, uncovering numerous emails where disparaging remarks were exchanged or strategies to undermine leadership were discussed. Several of these exchanges had been forwarded to HR anonymously by concerned employees or caught through routine monitoring. Legal counsel was engaged to ensure that disciplinary measures complied with company policy and labor laws, minimizing risk of retaliation claims. Yet Theron's approach remained firm but fair. Those who acknowledged their mistakes and committed to change were given opportunities to rehabilitate their standing through mentorship and monitored reintegration. However, for those who refused to adapt or who had committed severe breaches, termination became necessary for the health of the organization. The aftermath rippled beyond personnel changes. Morale began to shift noticeably. Employees who had felt silenced or sidelined now voiced ideas more openly in meetings. Teams once divided started collaborating more effectively. Performance metrics, previously stagnant or declining, showed early signs of improvement. Theron maintained a visible presence during this time, meeting regularly with HR, legal, and department leads to monitor progress and address ongoing concerns. His leadership style blended accountability with empathy, recognizing that culture change was a process requiring patience and persistence. At the end of one particularly grueling day, Theron stood alone in his office, overlooking the city skyline. The weeks following the sweeping disciplinary actions were transformative in ways few had dared to imagine. Theron Miles, once the target of whispered jokes, invisible dismissals, and deliberate exclusions, had become the embodiment of change, silent yet unyielding. Each morning, as he entered the building, the atmosphere had shifted. It was no longer thick with the weight of skepticism and quiet derision. Instead, there was a tentative respect, a sense that something new was unfolding. Walking to the executive floor, he passed the break room where, not long ago, he had eaten alone amid avoidance and silence. Now employees greeted him with nods, some even pausing to exchange brief words. The transformation was not universal. Change of this scale never is, but the cracks in the old walls were widening. Theron's office was a reflection of his journey. Walls painted in muted tones, shelves lined with books on leadership and justice, and prominently displayed was the black and white photograph of his father, a man who had dedicated decades to this company, only to be passed over for promotion time and again because of unspoken biases. The image was a powerful reminder of legacy and perseverance. Beneath it, a brass plaque bore the words, "Respect is not optional." This phrase had become Theron's guiding principle. To him, respect was not a favor to be granted or withheld based on convenience. It was a fundamental right, a foundation upon which all other success and collaboration must be built. Theron understood that the real work was only beginning. Dismantling systemic inequities required more than executive orders and disciplinary measures. It demanded continuous vigilance, ongoing dialogue, and a willingness to confront uncomfortable truths. To that end, he launched a comprehensive cultural initiative aimed at fostering inclusivity, equity, and accountability. This included mandatory workshops on unconscious bias, leadership coaching focused on empathy, and the establishment of an anonymous reporting system that empowered employees to speak up without fear of retaliation. Theron also created a cross-functional diversity and inclusion council tasked with regularly reviewing policies, monitoring progress, and advising on best practices. The council included voices from every level and background within the company, ensuring representation and transparency. As months passed, these efforts began to bear fruit. Employee engagement surveys showed marked improvements in trust and morale. Collaborative projects increased, innovation flourished, and the company's bottom line started to reflect the renewed energy. But beyond metrics, the most profound change was cultural, a shift from survival in silos to thriving as a community. Theron continued to lead with the same quiet strength that had carried him through adversity. He maintained open channels of communication, regularly hosting town halls where questions and concerns were met with honesty and respect. His leadership style was a blend of firmness and compassion, holding people accountable while nurturing growth. On one particularly reflective evening, Theron stood by the floor-to-ceiling window of his office, gazing out at the city lights flickering below. He thought back on the long road that had brought him here, the slights, the exclusions, the moments of doubt and loneliness. But most importantly, he thought of the power of resilience. He believed that justice was not about punishment alone, but about restoration and progress. It was about creating spaces where every person's dignity was honored and their contributions valued. His father's legacy, etched on the wall behind him, was a testament to that belief. The phrase "respect is not optional" was more than a motto. It was a call to action. Theron knew that real change required continuous effort, that the fight against injustice was ongoing. But he also knew that by standing firm, by insisting on respect and accountability, he had opened a door for others who might one day walk through it. His journey was a reminder that power could be wielded not to dominate, but to uplift, that courage could be quiet but unbreakable, and that true leadership was measured not by titles, but by the dignity one afforded others. As the night deepened, Theron turned away from the window and sat down at his desk, ready to face the challenges of tomorrow with the same unwavering resolve. The company was no longer the place it had been. It was becoming something better. And so was he. The end. If you enjoyed this story, please take a moment to like and subscribe for more powerful narratives like this. We'd love to hear your thoughts. What did you think of Theron's journey and the twists along the way? Also, tell us where you're watching from in the comments below. Your support and feedback mean a lot.